Right now, everybody is talking about cryptocurrency, and the cybercriminals are hiding in the conversation. Cybercriminals use social engineering loaded with urgency and fear to successfully prey on your company, your employees, and your customers. Spear phishing is just one of 13 types of email threats. Barracuda has identified these 13 types and shows you how you can protect your company, your customers, and your reputation. Find out about the 13 email threat types and Barracuda email protection. Get your free ebook at securityweekly.com/Barracuda. That's securityweekly.com/Barracuda. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. Follow us on Twitter for live stream reminders, highlighted clips, memes, and more. You can find us at Sec Weekly, even. Joining us tonight, Nate Warfield, Director of Threat Research and Intelligence at Eclypsium. In 2020, Nate was named one of Wired Magazine's Wired 25 for starting a volunteer group providing threat intelligence to hospitals and healthcare organizations during the COVID-19 pandemic. Previously, Nate has worked for Prevalian, Microsoft, and F5. Nate is joining us tonight to tell us the full story of 3 new vulnerabilities found in BMCs by Eclypsium's research team. Nate, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Paul. It's good to be here.
Dude, it's great to have you here on the show and not on an internal call, although those are fun too.
Yeah.
Nate, how'd you get your start in information security?
Oh man. So actually my official career in InfoSec kind of started late. I spent most of my actual my W-2 career was mostly doing network engineering. But I've been hacking computers. I think I hacked my first computer when I was about 12, like a BBS over dial-up so that I could download Wolfenstein. But yeah, so I've been hacking stuff for most of my life. I was sort of the network guy that knew all about security. And finally, in 2016, I decided I should make it a career. So I moved over to the MSRC at Microsoft and ended up shipping Windows patches for 4.5 years. And then after that, I was just like, this is way more fun than dealing with being on call and having somebody call me in the middle of the night saying, the network's down and Hotmail has 20 million users that can't connect to their inbox.
It's awesome. You also created, was it the threat intelligence thing you created for the COVID-19 thing? But you've done some other stuff creating groups that work on providing assistance for instant response. Is that true?
No, so the one we created, it was a CTI League, and that started, that was the one that we got written up for. So that was, let's see, it was March of 2020. I had just gotten back from Tel Aviv where I had done a talk at Blue Hat Israel about basically looking for Citrix ADCs that had been, that was right when the Citrix 2019-1978-1 vulnerability had come out. So I did a talk about how to find these things using Shodan and stuff. And so I was one of the people that was like, I'm going to stay in the office as long as I can because I have 4 screens and I'd rather work here than at my kitchen table. And basically started looking around and I saw an article about a German hospital that had been hit with ransomware. So I was like, all right, let me go use my fancy enterprise Shodan license that Microsoft gave me and ended up pulling down 300 hospitals across the US that had this Citrix vulnerability that was unpatched, including the medical facility that I use here in Washington. So that was sort of this oh crap, my own doctor could get hit with ransomware. I could hack into this thing with a tweet, basically. Mm-hmm. So that put the gears in motion. And I had just put something out on Twitter about hey, we need to, all of us InfoSec people that are now at home and have all this kind of time on our hands, we should be helping out our hospital friends. And the thing that kind of was difficult is I actually couldn't get a hold of anybody at the hospital. I literally went on LinkedIn and found somebody whose LinkedIn profile said he was an IT manager and tried to connect with him on LinkedIn. In my 200 characters, I was basically saying, hey, you have a NetScaler at this IP address that's vulnerable. You should patch it. But a friend of mine, Ohad Zeidenberg out in Israel, reached out to me and said, hey, we should start a group. We ended up doing that in a matter of a day. We brought Mark Rogers in. And so between Mark's connections, my connections, we built this. It ended up being 1,500 people in a month that we built. We had, everybody from CISA to a bunch of the ISACs to Interpol, Europol, FBI, Homeland Security. And so we basically just spent, most of the summer and the spring and the summer and even the fall of 2020, just giving out free threat intel stuff to hospitals, trying to help them. So that was the big group that I started. I haven't started anybody else yet.
Yeah, it's awesome. Great.
Was that a threat?
Was that a threat?
Yeah.
Honestly, that group, I love what we did. It was the closest I ever came to burning out. After 6 weeks of basically working 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, like somebody pulled me aside and said, "Dude, you're burning out." And I was like, "Oh, yeah, you're right." So yeah, it was light. It was really cool what we did. I could not do it again.
Bravo. Man's got to know his limitations.
Yeah.
Nate, tell us about your work at Eclypsium.
So yeah, at Eclypsium, I'm the director of threat research and intelligence. So I have a team of researchers that basically they spend our time both essentially authoring like detection work for our customers, but what we really enjoy doing is going and doing actual research against like firmware type vulnerabilities. We posted some stuff about like what we found in Juniper. I did a whole bunch of research against like F5 and Citrix this year. And then this sort of late in the summer, this BMC and what we ended up as on Monday, we disclosed as BMC and C came out. So basically,
I just want to say for the audience, I won't say what the names were. It had a lot of other names before BMC and C, and that's what we'll call it. And I won't tell you what the other names were.
Yeah. We went through a lot. I know that BMC and C Music Factory was definitely suggested. We did it for anybody that's wondering. It is definitely a Command and Conquer theme. If the graphic on the blog wasn't a giveaway. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so we ended up through a series of events.
Before you get there,
yeah,
we covered your F5. Give us the TLDR for your F5 research that I thought was very. When you sent me that blog post review, I was like, dude, this is awesome.
Yeah, man. So I worked for F5 for like 10 years. And about 7 of those years, I was basically attached to Microsoft. Like the time Microsoft was buying around $30 to $40 million a year worth of F5 devices. I think by the time I left that team, they had something like 3,800 F5s inside their network. So I spent a bunch of years helping them design, deploy, troubleshoot, architect all of their F5 like deployments. I deployed the F5s that ran Xbox Live when it first went out. F5 deployed F5s that ran the Office 365 geolocation DNS service that gave you, routed you to the fastest data center to you. And then finally in 2014, I decided I'm going to move over to Microsoft and do that there. So I came out with a lot of knowledge of F5, and I've done a bunch of talks, right? Like I mentioned in Tel Aviv, I was doing a talk that was sort of defensive focused on, Citrix devices. And then sort of one of the sort of catalysts for this was in June of 2020, there was an F5 CV or vulnerability that came out. It was 2020-5902, which was a remote code execution, completely unauthenticated. And we spent, like myself and a bunch of folks in the CTI League, we were only 3 months in at that point. We basically spent our entire 4th of July weekend doing sort of like incident response, threat analysis stuff, trying to help the hospitals get ahead of this because the POC, once again, the POC fit in a tweet. We were pretty we actually ended up coordinating with John Matherly over at Shodan. So he put some detection stuff into Shodan that we were able to use. Andrew over at Gray Noise, we put some stuff there so we could start figuring out who was exploiting this. But we basically burned our whole 4th of July weekend looking for this thing. And I should point out that I can't remember his name, but he goes by @Buffalo_Overflow on Twitter, and I think he works for NCC Group. He was nice enough to share the POC with me. That's how we got ahead of this. But we spent all this time, and then Monday after the 4th of July, somebody drops the POC into Metasploit because they thought it was cool, and of course, widespread exploitation starts up. Fast forward to this year, and I was like, I'm kind of tired of doing these defensive talks. Like they're fun, but I'm not a red teamer, but I do know enough about this device and these systems to do something kind of offensive. So in May, I decided I'm going to do an offensive talk. I'm going to use this 2020 exploit. I'm going to build this thing about how you can get persistence on an F5. And it was somewhat fortuitous, right? Because like I'm sitting there in May. I think I just gotten accepted to speak at NorthSec up in Montreal. And all of a sudden, Mandiant puts out a report about this UNC 3524. Yeah, 3524.
Mandiant is numbers. Usually,
I've been quoting this number for the whole summer, and now I'm like second guessing myself.
It's 35.
But anyhow, Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so they put out this report about a threat group out of Russia, or they suspect out of Russia that they think may have links to APTs, whatever the Russian ones are. I forget. I don't really care that much at the end of the day. But they put out
It's
this
a bear.
article
It's like
about
Cozy
this.
Bear. Cozy Bear.
They
It's a
use the
bear.
numbers. There's like APT like 28 and 29 or 38 and 39. I don't know. Like everybody has their own names, right? Microsoft used the periodic table of elements for both APT names and Azure development cycles, which is kind of funny. Yeah. So they put this report out, and I'm like, cool. And I read it, and they're talking about the fact that this group, who's a state espionage or very advanced cyber espionage group, and like these completely terrible ways that they were getting persistence on these things. Now, granted, they were still getting like 1.5 years persistence in dwell time, but like their implants were so bad, they had to put web shells in to restart them and all this other stuff. So I was like, dude, I can do a lot better than this. And then like 3 days later, this other F50, like a CVS 10 comes out, or CVS SS10, and it's even better than the one from 2020. Like guys at Horizon 3 wrote a POC for it, and basically you run Python code and it looks just like the F5 shell. So from there I was like, okay, I know how to do this. And so I basically spent the summer like sending off abstracts to different conferences, and I always sort of evolve my talk. Like I'm doing the research while I'm submitting things, so every time I go to a conference it's like, hey, you have 6 or 8 weeks of new research that I'm going to put into this talk. But yeah, so I ended up figuring out how to do like low-level persistence against F5 devices, burrow malware inside their config backups, how to make it survive past reboots, past upgrades. So I broke them, and then right before I went to Echo Party, I figured out how to break Citrix and do the same thing. The idea was like, if I can do this with like open source tooling, and I'm not a red teamer, I'm not like some Russian state actor, like I'm doing this in my spare time. And my techniques are better than the Russians, so that was kind of fun. I
thought that was really awesome because you weren't necessarily disclosing any new exploits. It was all about like, once you exploit it, how can I be better to persist, not just reboots but upgrades as well, which I thought was the impressive part.
And infect backup files. That was the thing I thought was really fun. Was like you could just get pwned and then back your system up. Okay, we're going to take a config backup, or maybe you take backups every night. Like Microsoft, we used to take config snapshots on like a daily basis just so that it was there if we needed it. So if you get hit with what I'm doing, I get in, it goes into your config backup, and then a week or two later you realize, oh crap, something happened, and then you just flatten the device, reinstall your backups from 2 weeks ago or a week ago, and I'm still there. Yeah, and it definitely wasn't. It wasn't about finding a 0-day. I'm not an exploit dev. I don't really have the time or the patience to try to find vulns. So I went on the premise of like, these things get popped all the time. Let's see how bad we can get in there.
That's good stuff. And you've presented at a number of conferences, and there's a blog post on Eclypsium site.
Oh yeah, blog post. I went to NorthSec, Troopers, BrewCon, LabsCon, and Echo Party. I just kind of shotgun CFPs out or abstracts out, and I usually assume my imposter syndrome is like, yeah, you send out 10, you might get 2, and then I always end up getting accepted to way more than I expect, which then puts pressure on me. Like everything has to be better and different. So by the time I went to Echo Party, like it was completely phenomenal.
It's awesome. In the meantime, there were these BMC vulnerabilities that were floating around out there. I guess first for our audience, Nate, like let's define what a BMC is and some of the protocols that we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, so BMC is what they call Baseboard Management Controller, and it's designed to do like lights out management of enterprise level servers, right? So you've got your server system that's set up. It's got all of its fiber optic connections or whatever, I don't know, 10, 40, 50 gig, whatever they're using these days. And then you've usually got like a gig, Ethernet gig link that's your sort of management backplane. And the BMC is designed so that you can do everything remotely that you would be able to do, back in my .com days. I had a server closet, and I could go in there and push the reset button on a server. Well, when you've got a data center with 400,000 or 500,000 servers in it, and it's 1,000 miles away, you need the ability to do the same thing. So BMCs allow you to connect in on a backplane. This thing continues to run no matter what happens. So like, say Windows gets a blue screen of death and just completely locks up. you can still get into the BMC and you can do like a power reset. So it's essentially just it's giving you the powers of a physical presence in front of the server, but over the network.
I remember when I first started seeing these in data centers in the early 2000s. I was like, you can do what with that? I'm like, yeah, that's going on a separate network entirely. I'm like, that's frightening. I'm like, but also useful because I didn't have to go all the way downstairs to reboot a server. I could do it remotely.
And
I'm lazy.
Except people forgot that first step of putting that on a separate network still to this day. And
changing the default passwords on it, and
I will give Microsoft credit on this. Their deployment, their management structure that they did was phenomenal. I think it took us about 7 or 8 minutes between when I started to log into the management network before I could actually get into a device. Like there was 3 different hot boxes, smart cards, RSA tokens. Like it was Fort Knox. But that's Microsoft with hundreds of billions of dollars to spend, right? Your average, your small people, right? Maybe is it too soon to talk about rack space?
Never too soon.
It is not.
Never.
Yeah. So you don't architect it that well, or you get sort of grandfathered into something that people design for convenience instead of security. And now, or in the same sense, right? If you're an admin, I mean, we knew as admins, as sort of like when I was at Microsoft, I think I had access to like 60,000 plus pieces of networking equipment with my accounts. So we got the extra special training about being careful to not get hacked. But now, you become a target.
But now BMCs, we've got like I remember and still recognize Dell Drac, and then went through multiple names.
ILO.
ILO was called all kinds of different different things. In this
IPMI.
case, but IPMI is a protocol, correct? That it uses to interface with these various BMCs. And then you've got AMI, and their product is called Mega Rack, which is built onto boards. In Intel's case, it's the one I'm probably most familiar with. It's glommed onto Intel ME, and since that, like ME is used for more things than just active management technology or this same kind of functionality, right? ME has really low level access to all of the hardware on the computer. Is that the same case in BMCs or?
I think Intel, and I'm not the expert on Intel ME. I've never really cared that much about like client side stuff. I'm more a server guy, but I think Intel ME, as I understand it, is more for like managing your like fleet of laptops and desktops. But I mean, it sort of at a high level, they're basically the same thing, right? It's a way to be able to manage, be able to have the physical access level of power over our network. So it's similar, but I think with BMCs, it's a little bit. I don't know if the ME gives you the capabilities to do this, but for example, with MegaRack and most of these BMC software, you can literally I can stick a flash drive into my laptop and I can remotely mount it to that server so it looks like a hard drive or a CD-ROM. I can say, okay, I'm going to mount this. I can mount a drive remotely, and now I've got an installation media, or I can do whatever I want that way.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's like an ME. Intel ME is the management hardware and software. One of the modules to that software is AMT. I think AMT has that feature, but I'm not 100% certain. But so like AMT is a feature of ME essentially that allows the same functionality as a BMC would on a server side. Yep. I guess my question is, we may have to go back to our team at Eclypsium to get the answer, is ME in the Intel side is used for more things than just management of like a BMC style management. It's used for things like turning off manufacturing mode. It's used for like, I think it brokers some of the key access for some of the other boot guard for boot guard and stuff like that. So like it does more than just this management function. But in this context, when we're talking about AMIs, this is solely basically an embedded system, right? The IoT device, if you will, inside of the server that allows you to manage it at that level.
Yeah, I want to say I feel like ME's probably got a little bit higher privilege or more access than the BMC. Like I've been dealing with a lot of questions, as you might imagine, since Monday about what BMCs can do, and so I've read the MegaRack documentation a few times, and it's not quite. It doesn't seem to be quite as pervasive of being able to get into like some of the like super low level stuff.
Sure.
But the fact of the matter is, it's like I can now get a physical access to your server over the network. So
you're still below the operating system.
Yeah, I'm still below the operating system. I can do whatever I want.
Right. Now, down to the protocols, though. IPMI, I forget what the acronym stands for, to be honest with you, but it is a protocol that you would use to interface with a BMC to do management. One of the protocols.
Yeah.
Like typically there's a web interface too. Like I remember logging into web interfaces and controlling it that way.
Yeah.
Intelligent platform.
Yeah, and like HPILO, HPILO was similar, right? It was a web interface. In this instance, the vulns we found were actually in the Redfish implementation, and Redfish is sort of one of those everybody's sort of moving to these open standards of stuff, right? Like there's even an open BMC project that I believe it's like AMI is behind. So that's like, all of the cloud providers and these big companies have decided, hey, it's kind of dumb for us to do these things all by ourselves. So that's where like open BMCs come out, Redfish has come out. You've got like the Sonic project that Microsoft and I think Facebook and Google have done for like SDN, like an SDN operating system. But yeah, so what we found was against the Redfish API implementation. And
Redfish is an API implementation, so you can interface with a BMC.
Yeah. Gotcha. Well, Redfish, it's more than interfacing with the BMC. The idea is that, nowadays, you think back, I'm old, right? I started with, data centers were like 10 or 15 servers, right? And I've worked at a .com where I think I had 5 servers. But now when you're looking at like Cloudflare, Rackspace, Azure, AWS, where you're talking servers, the counts of servers are measured in the millions. You can't, a web interface is pointless, right? Yeah. All of this stuff needs to be managed programmatically. So APIs are king these days. So yeah, Redfish is a full MPI implementation that lets you do, I don't know it that well, but from what I've looked at, it's almost like SNMP on crack, I guess.
Yeah. Like you made it like it's not SNMP, but you drew some similarities between the two in that.
Yeah.
Like SNMP has the standard set of what do they call MIBs that it supports.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then
OIDs and MIBs.
The manufacturer OEM can create custom MIBs to handle a certain piece of functionality that's in the hardware that they're supporting. So you got an extended MIB. And what you were saying was Redfish worked in a similar manner in that respect.
Yeah. Yeah. Redfish is very similar, right? You've got there's the sort of basic stuff, right? Like host name and, CPU count and memory, but then each vendor each sort of motherboard vendor, or, even the BMD, I don't know, A-Speed is one of the big vendors that makes these sort of system on chip things from lights out management. Yeah, so there's, they just basically can implement whatever functionality, whatever access that their hardware components have to the system gets implemented in Redfish. The spec is ridiculously huge.
And would you interface with Redfish over IPMI, or does Redfish replace IPMI?
No, it's HTTPS call.
Okay.
Yeah, gotcha. It just goes over TLS to a web interface, and then it's an API just like everything else.
Also important, I think you said lights out. The BMC, even if the computer or server is powered off, as long as there's a power cable plugged into it, that BMC has power.
Yeah. Yeah, you can't turn it off unless you physically unplug the electricity from the machine.
And you start to think about how this applies for things like cloud providers or rack, where you're doing scaling dynamically over hundreds of servers, and things like Terraform, or the dynamic calls to APIs in order to spin up a physical server, in order to spin up a virtual server, and then be able to mount and leverage some of these low-level controls for remote code execution, all kinds of nefarious things. This is where the story really starts to get interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point, right? And I like that you say hundreds, Tyler, because that's hundreds. When I was at Microsoft, the Azure data center provisioning, essentially they buy it's pre-populated racks of equipment, and they just wheel them in, bolt them down, plug them in, and turn them on. They connect to an orchestration engine that basically says, okay, you've added capacity. So they're adding capacity at like 50 to 60 servers at a time, all day long, every day. But yeah, once you get in,
they've upgraded from there. They do shipping containers worth now. They literally just plug a shipping container in. So it's got, I think it's 10 or 20 racks. It's depending if it's a 20 or 40-foot shipping container. They literally just drop the shipping container, put a monstrous plug on one end, and hook up air outlets, and boom.
Right?
Yeah.
Right, Tyler?
Yep.
Oh, but that's how Microsoft did the underwater one as an experiment, because it was already like a thing to have a shipping container. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, I shouldn't go too deep into details. I'm not really under an NDA from leaving Microsoft, but yeah, they have a big data center out here in Washington that was sort of the classic, 2 million square foot massive thing. And then as they ran out of space, they started just like basically parking like 18-wheeler containers outside the thing and hooking them up. But yeah, the capacity's added at like ridiculous amounts of systems. And yeah, anything you get. The thing that's interesting about the BMC stuff, right, is that a lot of it is Linux based. And while we didn't find anything that would specifically let you do, like, I don't know, raw memory access to the running operating system, I suspect that there probably is a way to do it, right? With that level of access, there's got to be ways to get in.
I know there's been some ME research into that, but like we've established already, ME is different from what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So the vulnerabilities that were discovered were in MegaRack is the product from AMI that is the software component to the BMC that would live on the server, correct?
Yeah, so MegaRack essentially it's code that OEMs license from AMI, right? And if you've had a computer anytime in the last, 30 years, you've probably turned it on and ignored or maybe missed that little AMI BIOS thing that shows up on your screen as your computer starts up. So they've been making BIOS, and back in the BIOS day, I think they started in 1985 was when they started making stuff. So they've been around for a bit. And so what they do now is MegaRack is just code that they've written, and they license it to people, right? So they will sell MegaRack software to any OEM that wants it. I imagine that this is consumed as sort of like a module. You get based on what we understand of how the OEMs are patching it. I'm fairly certain that they get some level of source code access, right? They say, "Hey, this is the code path that you get." And then they can incorporate it into their own product however they want. And this is actually one of the things that became challenging. Once we realized we'd found these vulnerabilities, we started working with some folks in the trust groups that we're in, basically trying to say, how many of these things can we find online? We did some looks in Shodan. We didn't find a lot, but we coordinated with some other folks who have their own like scanning infrastructure, and they ran some bunch of scans. And once, I think we only found maybe 3,000 instances of what we believe to be MegaRack on the internet, which, when we're talking, there's still like 2 million SMB exposures on the internet, like 3,000 is nothing.
Yeah, but that's the problem. That could be, and I don't want to, I'm not trying to like speak ill of any manufacturer. I'm just trying to give insights into how it works. So if like you're a Dell, HP, or Supermicro, let's say, and you're making a server, you're going to specify what kind of hardware you want inside that server to be manufactured as part of it. One of those points is the actual chipsets, the hardware that's going to run the BMC. Then you got to go get some software or firmware in this case that's going to be installed, and then you're going to license MegaRack from AMI, and you're likely, I don't know of any certainty, this is just speculation, is what I know in general about the market so far, is I'm going to license it, and that gives me like an SDK essentially where I can change stuff, right? Like when I bought my framework, I did research like where did they get the UEFI BIOS from? Oh, they got it from inside, and they license that source code and they customize it. In the case of UEFI, I can speak a little more definitively of like they have to make changes inside of that source code that are specific to the hardware they're producing. My guess, and again, I don't know for certain, my guess is it's a similar scenario. You got BMC hardware, you're licensing some firmware, you get an SDK. Maybe you're changing the banner. Maybe you're changing some other hardware-specific things because your hardware build is different from what's provided from AMI, and you're making that all work, and that's ultimately what gets shipped. So identifying that could be kind of interesting, unless you're analyzing the actual firmware itself, which we do.
Yeah, I mean,
Eclypsium.
At the end of the day, the only way we could really look without trying to do anything invasive, like, I don't know, throw an exploit payload at it, the only way we could look was basically saying, like, pulling the initial login page and looking for the string mega rack.
Right.
So yeah, if I mean, and actually I don't, as far as I know, Supermicro is not a mega rack customer. So
gotcha.
But let's say I know that HPE released an advisory today with patches for their BMC, for their mega rack BMC firmware.
Yep.
So even so, and I don't. Once again, I hope nobody from HPE is going to sue me on this. I don't know if HPE brands it with mega rack, right? They may, like you said, consume this SDK, put their own branding on it, slap their own logos on it.
Yeah, but that could be totally fine. That could be their license agreement with AMI. Yeah. It's like, oh, you can brand this as your thing, and you pay the extra fee. I'm just assuming. We're just speculating, like, because this is again, we're speculating, but with some background knowledge. As Nate and I work in this field and kind of understand how it works in other areas, I don't want to say we have specific knowledge of exactly how it ends up in all these OEMs and gets shipped, because as we've established so far, the supply chain is pretty complicated when we talk about this stuff.
I've been working. I was on an email thread with AMI PCert as of like a couple hours ago, and I can tell you, I still don't know, nor do I really want to know all of how the sausage is made. But my understanding is they basically you license the code, and they say, here, you've got MegaRack MegaRack, SPX version. You can do pretty much whatever the heck you want with it. Use it however you want. They don't care, because at the end of the day, you're licensing it. And we're talking about how I have no idea how licensing works, but say you're Dell, you make more than 1 or 2 computers a year, so the license it's probably fairly lucrative. I mean, they don't care. Yeah, but the thing that's interesting though
it's all above board. Like, this is
it is.
There's nothing nefarious here that we're talking about. This is just your licensing technology to incorporate in your technology as part of the supply chain. That's really it.
Yeah, and most of the vendor documentation that I've been reading.
It is, but Josh is very astute. Yes, it is where your SBOM would come in to say, yes, we've got these components inside. You don't have to tell me how, like to Nate's point, like how it's licensed or how the sausage is made. Just what components ended up in it when it was shipped.
Right.
Yeah, so and most of the documentation that I've read, the vendors are pretty transparent. Like, I think I was looking at Gigabyte and a couple other motherboard manufacturers, and their documentation literally will say there'll be like, BMC, like the big PDF that talks about the BMC. They'll even say like log into the MegaRack XPX like console, and then they'll and actually I was comparing. I think I was looking at Gigabyte and maybe Asus or somebody else, and I was like, wow, these guys. I think that AMI may have even provided them with sort of like here's the documentation template for how to do all of the things, how to set up all the settings. Because it was almost identical, but in like, how do you set up remote logging, or how do you set up radius authentication? It was pretty much the same information. So I think that, they basically just give them, say, hey, here's the software bundle, here's the documentation bundle, and do with it what you will.
I think we skipped a part in this story. I would really like to hear, like, how did you get the code and start to look at some of the things inside of AMI that led to the CVEs.
I would just like to read our official statement on this. It says Eclypsium Research was made aware of a leak of intellectual property purported to come from AMI, which had been posted online.
Yes, I want to say this. AMI has been phenomenal to deal with. Having worked 4.5 years of vulnerable response at Microsoft, I helped ship the MS-1710 patches. I worked Spectrum Meltdown, Bluekeep, Deja Blue. Like, if it had a logo on a website between 2016 and 2020, it was probably my vuln at MSRC. So I've dealt with all of the big players, the Intels, the BSDs, the AMDs, all of these. AMI was phenomenal to work with, and I'm not going to go and say these specifics, but like Paul said, we were made privy to the information that there was a substantial leak of IP that was purported to come from them. We got it. We started looking into it, and when we found what we found, we let AMI know and said, hey, we think we found a thing. We don't know for sure if this is legit, but they were super cool about it. They said, okay, they took it, they reviewed it, and they said, yeah, this is legitimate vulnerabilities that you guys have found.
And as a result of that research, and Vlad deserves a ton of credit. Was an awesome individual to work with.
Vlad Babkin, Eclypsium Research. Like, give a shout out for him, because he's my guy. He's stuck in the Ukraine, and we wish him all the best.
Yeah, he's awesome, and we do wish him the best for sure. And so, arbitrary code execution via the Redfish API. I think now, up into this point in the segment, that makes a lot more sense than if you were to read it without the backstory that we just gave, right?
Yeah.
And so, what were some of the details behind this?
So basically, we went digging around, and the information that we found, we started. He quickly narrowed in on looking at the way the Redfish API had been implemented and what system calls it was able to do. And fairly quickly, he basically figured out that there was calls that it made to, I believe it was Lua. And these Lua calls would hit an os.execute call, which was like, okay, well, if you can do os.execute and the Redfish API runs over, God, I want to say it's light HTTPD, but please don't quote me on that. Whatever the HTTP service that runs on the MegaRack BMC runs as root. So if you could get this thing to hit the OS execute call, you had root root permissions on the system. So he figured out how to formulate a call, doing an IFS hack, and don't quote me, it's enter something field separator.
Interfield separator.
Interfield separator. Interfield separator. Attack.
Remember the ping command injection vulnerability in Linksys routers?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
From like 2006, used the IFS separator.
Yeah.
I looked that up. Yeah. I actually sent that to Vlad. I was like, dude, that's it. He's like, I know, huh?
Yeah. And Vlad actually, he did it. He was a big CTF guy before he worked for us. So that didn't surprise me that was what he would find, because he's, in a certain point, he's not doing the like, oh my God, I need to run this through a fuzzer and I need to look for all these like, print Fs or, stir copies or mem copies. Like he just went with like, I mean, don't hate to say this, but he went with kind of the basics, and it turns out,
it worked.
These big companies are getting hit with the basics, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, F5's vulnerabilities, the F5 and the Citrix vulns from 2019 and 2020 were freaking path traversals.
Right.
That Orange Side talked about it at Black Hat 18 months before, and his Black Hat slides literally have the POC for both of those vulns. .. semicolon / right? So and it's and not to diss AMI, but it's stuff that I think, and it's just, it comes down to there's old code with old coding mistakes.
Yeah, we see a lot of firmware vulnerable to things like this, and it has the like same components that we see in a lot of firmware, and there's reasons for that. Light HTTPD is used because it's a really small and fast web server that you can put on in firmware that's running on that's hardware constrained. Lua is the same way. Lua uses the scripting engine because it's got a really small footprint and allows you to extend that. And we saw, OpenWRT adopted Lua because they got to run on really small devices. So
yeah. And also, when you're talking about these sort of resource constrained things, all of the glory that we get with Windows 11 of like ASLR and like all of these protections that have been developed for desktop operating systems. I mean, that's why my Chrome instance takes 2 gigs of memory, right? There's all these things that are happening.
Sandboxing and all.
Yeah,
sandboxing. And there's still zero. There's still 0 days in Chrome where we got stories about that.
Yeah,
of course.
But I mean, having worked at Microsoft, right? I watched as the whole thing was raising the bar for attackers. So I mean, at a certain point, you guys were talking about Chromebooks, those things are very secure, but I would argue that if you're talking about attacks outside of phishing and outside of some of this stuff, you're talking like throwing a 0-day at a Windows 11 machine is complex. Like you need 3 or 4 exploits to get from I went to a website to they have system level access, right? It's not the Windows 2000 days or the WannaCry.
And it's also not uncommon to have processes running as UID 0. There's not a lot of user separation because again, you're running in a constrained environment. So that user on this system is called sysadmin, is running as UID 0, but that's common across Linux-based firmware as well. And that was leading to the next one too, right?
Yeah, but I mean, I if I'm running a Linux desktop, like most of what I'm doing is not UID 0.
That's true. Well, because you're running on
a lives in hope, yeah.
Well, because you're running on a full desktop. But you're not running in, these BMCs are SOCs essentially with constrained amounts of CPU cycles in RAM, essentially.
Yeah, but they once again, right? And it was actually interesting as we talked to AMI. They were, like I said, they were cool to deal with, and we were giving them some sort of advice on like, hey, we've things that us, like, I mean, I'm an old school Linux networking dude. I've been using Linux for 25 years. things like CH rooted environments, right, where you can run these processes as in somewhat of a sandbox as much as Linux will give you. That was like some of the guidance we were giving them. I can't speak for how they'll implement it, but we're saying, hey, look, if this web process had been running in a restricted sandbox, like this would have been like not great, but it wouldn't have given us the level of access that we did. Yeah, and that's why it got a CVSS 9.9, right? There's a scope changed or unchanged thing in the CVSS score. And because the scope changed from, basically, hey, I'm hitting it with a web thing, I'm hitting it via the web I need a user account that's not essentially disabled. It needs privileges higher than none. But if I have that, I can now exploit it and I can drop into root level privileges. So that was, some of the guidance that we were giving. And it's unfortunately, it's not just them, right? It's a ton of IoT stuff, a ton of firmware level stuff. You get in through some ancient piece of Linux software or some API implementation that may have not been updated in 5 or 6 years, and now you've got God powers.
Or ICS, or real-time operating systems, all of the above.
Yes, I worked at Microsoft. I did the VxWorks. Was the VxWorks?
Yes.
There was like there's like rapid. Or was it Ripple something or other? I forget what it was called. Yeah, VX. I worked that one too. That was fun.
That was amazing timing.
There was also CVE 2022-40242 default credentials for UID 0 shell via SSH. So some of these systems had SSH, and I've done firmware reverse engineering before. So if you can, when they package the firmware, if you can get access to wherever the passwords are stored, that could be either the default password or some kind of backdoor account on the system. And especially if that hash is not salted, which happens. So I'm not sure if this was the case. I think I read where sometimes it's salted, sometimes it's not, depending on which version, which is likely the case, or was it just not salted at all?
So it didn't really matter if it was salted, because the password is something that John the Ripper would crack in about the first 5 or 6 tries. And once again, to AMI's credit, they actually tell when they ship this sort of, let's call it an SDK, when they ship this SDK to OEMs, their documentation quite literally tells them, hey, this account is here for development purposes. You should disable it before you package this up and put it on your systems. Now, apparently, all of these big OEMs don't RTFM, so they were shipping this stuff with it enabled.
Or they do, and it said you should. It's not must.
Yeah,
there's a big difference.
I got a deadline.
They're pulling the RFC thing, right, where it should versus must.
Yeah, sorry, I've literally spent my last couple of days reading thousands of pages of specifications and RFCs, and should versus must.
Are you also a network engineer?
I have been in the past.
Then I feel your pain. So they basically, the AMI, I mean, I think what they did was they trusted the OEMs to read the manuals, and the fix that they did for this was basically to ship their SDK with it disabled by default and tell them, hey, if you need to use this, turn it on yourself.
So they did get to that point. Because
why isn't this thing I've done for 10 years not work? So they turn it on and leave it. Never mind.
But as we've seen, I mean, not just with firmware, but in all things, if you leave it as an exercise to whoever is consuming your product or reference implementation to change something and follow the requirements and follow the specification, chances are they won't. Like Secure Boot as an example, right? I think it was Yuri that was telling me this. I'm like, wait, so it should check the revocation list DBX first and then the DB in order. He's like, yes, that is what the spec says.
Should.
It's like, it is up to whoever's implementing the UEFI actual implementation to make sure that they follow the spec and follow that logic.
You realize we built an entire computing infrastructure and the entire internet on a bunch of like, hey, you should probably do it this ways.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They're not laws. They're not rules. They're not like, you will do things this way or that way. It's basically like, hey, you should probably do it like this. I mean, look at BGP, look at DNS. That's why the internet is held together with bubble gum and duct tape.
I mean, look at the electricity in your home. Like, yeah, you should really ground that. Like, really,
I mean, I'll say this, like the electricity in my home, I'm pretty sure there's a law that says it has to be like 120 volts.
Yeah.
And if it's 135 volts, somebody's going to get busted for it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And AMI does have updated versions of this, but one of the things to keep in mind is because this is hardware or firmware inside of hardware, the ability for many places to actually update theirs, the OEMs, because it's got to come from AMI, it's got to go to the OEM. The OEM then has to push the update to the firmware, which the client is then responsible to make sure that those flashes happen in something that they probably don't want to go down across maybe hundreds of thousands of pieces of hardware. So the likelihood of this getting pushed out until a hardware life cycle happens is probably pretty low unless it's very, very critical infrastructure, which there are places that are taking this very seriously. So, that does
not
happen.
Very many.
Not everybody.
Well,
not enough.
I'll say this. And the one advantage. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was gonna sort of agree. The problem is that I remember, 2006 or 7. And I had to do a BIOS update on a laptop, and it called for a floppy drive. And I'm like, holy crap, I don't think I have one. And we're talking like, it was literally like in the manual, because I RTFM'd, because BIOS updates are not exactly what you might call fun. Okay. And I'm like, all right, what am I supposed to? Floppy drive. I had to go digging around, and I found a USB floppy drive in my e-waste pile. Okay.
I was able to update the BIOS. Floppy drive. It was one of the few things I saved when I cleaned out my garage after my divorce. I have a USB floppy drive that I will never throw away.
Yeah, I was going to say, you need to talk to our coworker, Ed. He's got every piece of legacy technology. In fact, we play a game on one of our weekly meetings where we ask Ed if he has something, and usually it's within arm's reach. If not, he just has to go to the garage.
But to get back to Tyler's point about these things, the one saving grace, there's a dark cloud and a silver lining. Dark cloud is, I don't know how easy it is to programmatically update 100 or 500,000 or 2 million servers BMC firmwares. However, because BMC runs on its own chip that's in this own processor, it's got its own isolated environment, you can update your BMC without actually rebooting your server. Right, so there's the idea of the BIOS update needing a floppy drive. That's bad, but that's a BIOS update. This is an entirely separate processor. So you theoretically can do this without any service impact. However, having worked for a large cloud provider, there's a very large paranoia of risk because bad things happen, and if bad things happen at scale, then the internet has, evolved to the point where 4 companies control everything we do.
What was the final vulnerability was user enumeration.
Yeah, so the user enumeration one was essentially, it's like an OWASP thing. I actually had somebody today on Mastodon point out that they don't believe it's user enumeration when it's a user oracle thing. But I looked it up on OWASP. Basically, you send an API call to do a password reset for a user, and based on how the API responds, it will tell you, and it says, hey, I want a password reset Paul. And if it says, oh, I don't know, who is Paul? Paul doesn't exist. Now I know Paul's not a user account. So, I could write a script and run through, 10 or 20,000 different usernames and say, hey, password reset each one of these users, and everybody that doesn't come back with a user doesn't exist. Now I have a password for them, or I have a user account for them. And now I have a refined database to then go run RockMe through.
Mm-hmm. And
it sounds very much like user enumeration.
That sounds like user enumeration to me.
I think so too. I do know and respect this. I know him virtually, and I respect him. So I don't pick fights on social media because I don't actually have any enemies in the community, and I like to keep it that way.
Oh, we can find you some.
But I can see that.
I'm waiting for my day to get my I put Kevin back check mark when I actually piss Mitnick off to the point where he blocks me, and I haven't figured out what to say to Jonathan Data 1 yet to piss him off to the point where he blocks me.
Yeah, there's some data analysis things I said, and he was like, and blocked me, and I'm like, oh, it's nice, whatever.
I don't want him to block me because he gives me joy every time I read his stupidity. It's like one of the highlights of my day. If I'm ever feeling like imposter syndrome, I'm like, I'm going to pull up his Twitter page and just be like, oh God, I'm not you. It's like watching it's like watching Cops. When you feel like you're having a bad day, you just go and watch Cops. You're like, oh my God, I'm not the person that's like high on meth getting arrested for DV with a squirrel in Florida.
Wow.
Which happens a lot in Florida.
More often than we'd like to admit.
That escalated quickly.
I'm disappointed it took us this long to get here.
I know, right?
I know. Can we have some extra minutes,
such
man?
Things about you.
I mean, well, Paul wanted to talk about vulns. I mean, you guys want to keep going?
I want to talk about mitigations and how we recommend people, other than our overarching recommendation of update your firmware, which complicates things. I mean, this is one of those cases where there's at least 3 parties in the supply chain that has to do something to mitigate, right? Like AMI has to release the patch, the OEM has to then package up that patch and release it, and then the end user has to actually apply it.
Shit, if we're going to talk mitigations, I'm going to need more bourbon.
Yes.
So, pass the ice.
I mean, really, from a management standpoint, the mitigations have been the same that they have been for the last 20 years. Like, you should not have management IPMI, regardless of what protocol it is. Like, management in general, even VMware level admin, like, that should all be on its separate segment in a separate VLAN. Put an ACL in front of, put a firewall, like however you're going to network engineer this, that the advice has always been the same. Those should be segmented and should have at least a jump box and or a different identity in order to access those.
Here you're going with the shoulds again,
step
Tyler.
1.
Here you go with the shoulds again.
And you're right, Tyler. And I think that like for this was an interesting one, right? Because like we engaged with CISA, however you want to pronounce it.
Oh, it's CISA.
And they were CISA. Is that how they like to? I have a lot of people call it CISA.
No, it's
CISA.
Like, they're wrong.
I think it's CISA.
They're wrong.
Yeah.
Sissy, definitely sissy.
CISA. Cis. Come on, CISA.
They kind of told us they're like, we are way in the weeds here. We've never had one of these before, so it's definitely was a sort of first of its kind incident. The saving grace, once again, is the fact that, like I said, we didn't find much of this stuff exposed to the internet, which is kind of amazing because if you go and look for like ILO, there's like thousands and like I think there's tens of thousands of ILOs still on the internet. So people either once again, maybe it's mega rack and we just can't detect it, or maybe they just actually got smart and didn't do it. So there's that, but the real problem
it's for remote management, and we need to manage it remotely. Therefore, we need to expose it to the internet, right? That's what I would do.
I think the other important thing to note, yet maybe it is not accessible to the internet, but an adversary that gains a foothold, initial access credentials, some SaaS level cloud access that has a network communication to on-prem or even into the cloud, like once you make that initial access leap, now we're talking about a whole nother thing where that may not be accessible to the internet, but because you didn't segment or you're not doing proper isolation, now those vulnerabilities have become and given you kind of a game over, long-term persistence, low-level access, ongoing ability to do very nefarious things at the hardware level. Like all of those things then come into play, which does make this a very big deal.
So when I breach your F5 with the next 0day or the next like CVSS 10.0 exploit, because you didn't realize that your self-IP's managements were turned on and exposed to the internet, and I drop my sliver implant, and I have persistence through your your backups, guess where your management interface is probably talking to? The same network that all your server BMCs are on.
That's what I sent Scott today. I was like, dude, why are you not referencing the F5 thing from freaking Nate? Like, this is a brilliant chaining of how this scenario will play out. And if the adversaries aren't thinking, like, obviously Nate is taking APT game to the next level and making the Bears look bad, but seriously, like, they're thinking about this, and this should be something that every organization needs to at least be looking at and making sure their segmentation's right.
It's terrible for me to say this, but I have always had a very deep respect for the advanced adversaries, and I'm
the real ones, right?
I'm legit. I am literally, if Mandiant comes out with a report in like a year saying that this Russian group decided to take my techniques and use them, I am putting that on my LinkedIn.
You're like honored. You're honored at that point.
No, I'll just be like, say like, hey, the Russian, like Sandworm learned from me. Like, I'll put that on my LinkedIn. I have no shame.
Contributed to FSB's TTPs.
I try to tell people how to catch it. I try to tell people how to detect it. So I told them first, if the APTs pick it up from me,
right,
it's not like you didn't get an advance warning.
At least we got warning. I mean, the other scenario is we didn't tell anyone, and APT started doing it, and no one had any warning. That's worse, in my opinion.
Or maybe I burned down their tradecraft. That would be kind of cool.
That too, for sure.
That would be awesome.
Nate, anything else on BMC and C?
No, I'll say this. This is going to be obvious for people reading the blog. So we've listed the CVEs. We've been updating it every day. The CVE links point to cve.org. AMI has repointed the details of the reference links back to our blog. So what we're doing is we are going to be updating this, like probably daily. As vendors release patches, we'll be updating. We have now a security updates chunk in the blog that wasn't there on Monday. We have the HPE advisory link in there. As we get learn about more, we'll be updating it pretty much in real time to list advisories. So if people think they're affected, we have become basically the sort of ground truth for this vulnerability. So if you're wondering about it, hit up our blog. If anybody comes across things that are advisories from different vendors that we haven't published, you can hit me up. I'm literally N0x08 on Twitter, Mastodon, GitHub. I'm Nate Warfield on LinkedIn. You can use nate@eclypsium.com as my email. Like we're trying to do the best we can to help protect customers in any way we can.
Awesome. Nate, are you taking a break from speaking? Because you've been on a whirlwind. You just got back from another trip, which wasn't a speaking thing. But
yeah, I spent 3 weeks in November traveling. I was in Argentina for 2 weeks for Echo Party and then a customer thing. I was in Singapore all of last week. I just dropped abstracts to Blue Hat Israel and Blue Hat Redmond. So if I'm lucky, I'm going to be going back to Tel Aviv at the end of March. And if I'm less lucky, I'll be going to Redmond, which is 10 miles away in February.
Awesome. Well, Nate, thank you so much for appearing on Paul Security Weekly.
Dude, thank you for having me. It's been awesome.
5 questions?
Oh, yeah. Oh, we got to do the 5 questions.
Oh, 5 questions. Oh, dude, we could keep going, man. It's only 5:00 in Seattle. Yes. I got a whole bottle of whiskey here too.
But we have to do 5 questions.
Okay, we need to bring him back. I like him.
I think we need to have like a beard off because I'm pretty sure I got you beat, man.
I think he's got us all beat.
Yeah, I'm close. I'm close.
You're getting there.
Nate, are you ready to play 5 questions with Security Weekly?
Is it like a never have I ever, or is it just like a normal have I question?
It's there's no right or wrong answer, so there's that.
Okay. I'm ready to play 5 questions.
All right, Nate, 3 words to describe yourself.
Bearded, tattooed, and a DJ.
If you were a serial killer, what would be your weapon of choice?
Probably bladed weapons.
If you would write a book about yourself, what would the title be?
Oh God, a book about myself. What would the title be? Don't follow me, you'll surely perish.
What is your favorite hacker movie?
Hackers, come on.
Yes.
Oh God, it's a tie between Hackers and Swordfish. I don't know.
Oh, okay. I'll accept that. Choose 2 celebrities to be your parents.
Alive, dead, fictional, or otherwise.
2 celebrities to meet my parents?
To be your parents.
Be your parents.
To be my parents. Oh God. I'm gonna go with Christopher Walken and Scarlett Johansson. As weird as that sounds.
Oh, I like it. You were rated almost like you prepared for that. Did you prepare for that or no?
No, I didn't. I was not prepared for that, but
I love it.
Yeah, let's not go into details of why I made those choices.
Outstanding, Nate. Thank you so much for appearing on Paul Security Weekly.
Paul, thank you for having me. Tyler, everybody here, I appreciate it. I want to come back. Let's do this again.
You're welcome back anytime. Coming up next, the security news. Stay tuned.